What's up, peeps and chooms? How y'all living? So, after I pissed in Reddit cereal over their idiotic broccoli theory, I am pleased that now I get to cover subjects that aren't considered a complete joke by anyone with an IQ that is greater than the double digits. And the first thing I want to do is revisit an old subject that is brought up fairly frequently by the hair loss community, and that is the subject of topical finasteride. So, we all know that oral finasteride works, and it works extremely well. It is the first line of defense that a doctor will recommend in the fight against androgenetic alopecia, and that is because it is the only treatment on the market that is proven to be safe and effective in over 90% of people, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well, as there is research showing that in a cohort of over 500 patients, the patients either maintained or continue to get benefits even after 10 years of usage, and with an extremely small incidence of side effects. And I did a very comprehensive video which proves that finasteride's benefits are good for both the short and the long term, and I'll link that below for anyone interested in that subject. Furthermore, it's been shown that even if people do get side effects, the side effects will usually go away on their own, and failing that, side effects can almost always be mitigated through dose titration, such as using 0.5 milligrams every other day as opposed to 1 milligram daily. So, oral finasteride will work extremely well in over 90% of patients, and for the few people where finasteride alone isn't enough, they can add minoxidil, and if for some reason they're not responders to minoxidil, they can add 0.1% tretinoin to their minoxidil to increase sulfotransferase activity, which is the enzyme that converts minoxidil into its active form, minoxidil sulfate, and some people by default don't have enough of this enzyme, hence why some people are non-responders. The point being though, even if you are a poor responder to minoxidil, you still have the option to add tretinoin, and I did a video explaining that in depth, and I'll go ahead and link that one below as well. So we are extremely blessed to be living in an era where the overwhelming majority of people can just take a pill and solve all of their hair loss problems. Nevertheless, as amazing as finasteride is, there are going to be an extremely small subset of people who cannot tolerate the drug even at very small doses. So for those people, is it possible for them to apply it topically and still get the same benefits while mitigating the risk of side effects? Well, if finasteride is so great, which it is, you would think that would work topically too, right? Well, good news, friends, there is evidence that it does, though the underlying problem is that topical finasteride is absorbed systemically, and we know this because research on topical finasteride shows that it suppresses serum DHT levels systemically rather than just locally. Now, lower serum DHT levels isn't the mechanism behind finasteride side effects. I mean, after all, DHT is a trash hormone, which is worthless after puberty, but the lower serum DHT levels do prove that it is absorbed systemically, which makes topical application seem kind of redundant. I mean, if it's going to absorb systemically, why not just take it orally and save yourself the trouble, right? Now, it has been shown that when people allegedly do get side effects from finasteride, it is frequently not due to any action of the actual medicine, but rather due to a nocebo effect. After all, finasteride, as amazing as it is, has developed a sordid reputation as a result of misguided fear-mongering and hysteria that many people have fallen victim to, and that even includes myself at one point. There really was a time when even if the slightest happening occurred in my life while on finasteride, I would think I was getting some horrible side effects. Like, for example, maybe one day I wasn't as horny as I was last week, and then I'd go to the hair loss forums and read all the horror stories, and then convince myself that I must be suffering from one of these horrible side effects. It wasn't until I actually took the time to do research on this drug and came to the realization that all these things that I thought finasteride was doing to me were just things that happened to me before I took finasteride, and I just took them for granted because I didn't think about them. So I know what it is like to have a nocebo effect, and given how fearful people are of taking oral finasteride, maybe one advantage of topical finasteride is that the topicals are generally seen as being safer than oral drugs, and that is because in many cases they are. A classic case would be topical versus oral minoxidil, where you have the topical drug which is sold over the counter without a prescription, and on the other hand you have the oral variant, which is almost never prescribed for any reason and is associated with a long list of potentially life-threatening side effects, including pericardial effusion, which is fluid buildup around the heart, which can literally crush the heart, and you can also have potentially other serious cardiac complications like heart attacks and passing out due to orthostatic hypotension, which is a severe blood pressure drop. This is especially a big problem because cardiovascular-related deaths are single-handedly the largest cause of death of the human organism on the planet, and one of the reasons it kills so many people is because many people have underlying heart problems without even knowing about it. So when people tell me why I don't endorse oral minoxidil, I tell them it's because I don't want blood on my hands. The point I'm trying to make about all this, though, is that since topicals are generally seen as safe, maybe one of the advantages is that there will be a reduced chance of a nocebo effect. And you notice that with people who say they got side effects from oral finasteride, but then the side effects went away when they started topical finasteride. Even when using fairly high doses of it, you would think that it wouldn't make any sense since the research shows it still absorbs systemically. But it does go to show just how powerful the power of suggestion really is. People really underestimate just how powerful a nocebo effect can be. But is there a possibility of a happy medium with topical finasteride where maybe we can apply it at a low dose that will legitimately reduce the already low risk of side effects from oral finasteride while maintaining most, if not all, of the same efficacy as oral finasteride? Well, we know finasteride is not extremely dose dependent, hence why 0.5 milligrams of oral finasteride only suppresses about 8% or so less DHT than 1 milligram. So in theory, it seems possible, but rather than be like Reddit and just propose a theory that explains everything, let's be more responsible and actually examine the research at hand before jumping to any conclusions. Now, I already did a video on topical finasteride where I compared it to oral finasteride, and I'll go ahead and link that below. In fact, this video should really be considered the second part, so if you haven't seen that video yet, I insist you do so, because a lot of the questions you may have about topical finasteride, perhaps I answered them there. But I'll also go ahead and link this article here that is a good review on the studies on topical finasteride up until a few years ago. But what I didn't address in that video specifically was the use of low doses of topical finasteride, namely 0.1% topical finasteride, which the hair loss community has recently taken a strong interest in. The concentrations of topical finasteride used in the studies from the review article that I previously went over range from as low as 0.005% from a study way back in 1997 up to 3% concentration. Now, in this review article, they did include two studies of topical finasteride at 0.1%. One of these studies combined 0.1% finasteride with 3% minoxidil, and the other combined 0.1% finasteride with 5% minoxidil. The results were similar, so let's just take a closer look at the trial that looked at 0.1% finasteride and 5% minoxidil, since that's the concentration of minoxidil most of us are using. So let's go ahead and go balls deep on the study, break it down, and see if we can ascertain some good outcome data from the research that is available here. So this study was from India, and it was published in 2015. In this study, they wanted to see if 5% minoxidil plus 0.1% topical finasteride could possibly replace 5% minoxidil plus oral finasteride at 1 milligram per day. So what they did is they enrolled 50 men with androgenic alopecia who at the start of treatment had pretty severe hair loss. I mean, we're talking Norwood 5 and 6 here, and their ages were between 20 and 40 years old. All these men were placed on topical minoxidil 5% twice daily and oral finasteride for a period of 2 years with considerable improvement in their hair density. Once again, this proves that oral finasteride and topical minoxidil is the gold standard for treating androgenic alopecia. Since doctors will usually recommend waiting a full year before determining how effective of a responder a patient is to hair loss treatments, we can assume that they're getting the full benefits of the drugs at this point. So when they started the actual study, what they did is that they switched them from oral finasteride to topical finasteride 0.1% while continuing the 5% minoxidil twice daily. 45 of the subjects went directly from oral to topical finasteride, but interestingly, 5 stopped all treatment for 8 to 12 months and lost all their gains before starting minoxidil and topical finasteride. So this is an interesting study design because they're showing results from patients who had switched right away to topical treatment, but they also included a small segment of people who stopped treatment altogether and went on to lose their gains before resuming treatment. This way, we can kind of get an idea of what kind of gains people can expect from switching treatment versus how effective it would be just starting the treatment. And again, let me remind you guys, these patients all originally had severe cases of androgenic alopecia. Their scalps had started out almost completely barren. They assessed the results every 4 months for everybody with photos and assessments of patient symptoms. So this table right here, table 1, shows the results, and as you can see, 25 patients' hair density was, quote, moderately maintained, unquote, after the shift to topicals. 7 patients had worsening, and 13 had their hair, quote, well maintained or improved, unquote. So these categories are pretty subjective, and there are no phototrichograms for accurate hair counts, so as far as we can tell, these assessments may have been biased or due to a placebo effect, as even things like lighting or hairstyling can influence how hair appears on photographs, and even using certain shampoos can make the hair look flatter or more voluminous. So without a proper tool to measure hair counts, like a phototrichogram, I can't say that these results are too trustworthy. So looking at the 5 men who stopped all treatment for 8 to 12 months before starting topical finasteride, all the patients saw improvement, and 4 had good improvement as shown here in table 2, but again, this was based on a photographic assessment, so who knows how good and reliable this is. Also, you would expect improvement just from restarting minoxidil alone, so it is difficult to interpret just how much the topical finasteride contributed to this, which is why a standalone study on topical finasteride would have been much more accurate in my opinion. So if you read the details and really just crunch the numbers of the study, we can see that in about 14% of patients, their hair gains when switching from oral to low-dose topical finasteride were, quote, poorly maintained or declined, unquote, while in 50% there was a drop in hair density and then a plateau at, quote, moderately maintained, unquote. Only 26% had hair that was well maintained or improved. They actually don't mention any side effects, so I assume there weren't any, but it would have been nice if they disclosed this because after all, the reason most people want to try topical finasteride is the premise that it may have a lower side effect profile than oral finasteride. But I think from the study, I would conclude that low-dose topical finasteride plus 5% minoxidil works in some people, but it doesn't seem quite as good for most people as oral finasteride plus 5% minoxidil. Now keep in mind that these people are people who had pretty severe hair loss to begin with, so maybe the results may not apply as much to people who, for instance, are Norwood 2s in their 30s. Maybe 0.1% topical finasteride doesn't have much systemic absorption, though this study doesn't really answer this question, but maybe it also just isn't enough for finasteride to do the job in some cases, at least in the case of the people who have severe hair loss. We know finasteride isn't very dose dependent, but when the doses are this extremely low, then maybe it does matter. So let's look at the next study that examines this very same subject. So we have one more study that was published in 2018, and it isn't mentioned in the review article, probably because it was published after the review article went to the press, and it is entitled, quote, comparing the therapeutic efficacy of topical minoxidil and finasteride with topical minoxidil and oral finasteride and androgenetic alopecia, a randomized trial, unquote. This article also comes from India, but the authors are different, and this study has a better study design since it is a randomized trial. In this study, they enrolled 50 male patients aged 18 to 45 with androgenetic alopecia between Norwood 3 and 4, so it's the same number of patients as the last study, although their hair loss isn't as severe. All had been on no treatment for the preceding 3 months. Patients were randomly assigned to 2 groups. Group A received minoxidil 5% and oral finasteride at 1 milligram daily. Group B got minoxidil 5% and 0.1% topical finasteride daily. The patients were treated with either combination of drugs for 12 months, and both photos and trichoscopes, which is similar to a trichogram, were taken every 3 months. So at least now we have a metric of measuring hair growth that is more objective rather than subjective, although they had some subjective measurements as well, such as requiring the patients to fill out the quality of life questionnaires. But the patients were blinded as to the treatment, and the doctors who interpreted the phototrichograms were also blinded, so there's definitely less of a chance of bias in this study compared to the last study at least. So anyways, let's get to the results. So there were originally 25 patients in each group, but 3 patients in the oral finasteride group discontinued treatment, and 5 patients in the topical finasteride group discontinued treatment. People in the topical finasteride group actually did better, as you can see in this graph here, but in group B, which is the topical finasteride group, 83% clinically improved versus 65% in the oral finasteride group. Interestingly, these numbers actually don't jive with the results presented in the text, which states that 14 out of 22, which is 64% in group A, and 20 out of 20, which would be 100% in group B, had favorable results. So I think there is some sort of typographic error in the text, but this kind of inconsistency doesn't exactly inspire confidence in the merits of the study. But let's go ahead and move on to what the tricograms do. They show this figure here, figure 2, but this is just photos from 8 patients, and they don't interpret these results in the text of the paper, so I'm really not sure what to make of these images. I mean, some of the patients do look like they have visual improvement, but what I don't understand is if they had access to a phototrichogram, which we know they did, why didn't they just measure the hair counts? I mean, this would have given us a much more objective outcome than a photo assessment, especially since we're comparing 2 treatments that are already combined with a clinically proven treatment, which is topical minoxidil. Picking up on subtle changes that may not be instantly noticeable in the photograph would have been really helpful here. So anyways, looking at table 2 here, they mentioned side effects, and fortunately there were no sexual side effects in the topical finasteride group, but in group A, which is the oral finasteride group, there were reports of sexual side effects. Specifically, there were 2 reports of erectile dysfunction, 2 reports of ejaculatory dysfunction, and 3 reports of loss of libido, although we don't know if these reports were all in different patients or just multiple side effects in the same 2 or 3 patients. Also, 4 subjects on oral finasteride reported anxiety and depression, so potentially a larger than expected number of systemic side effects in the patients on oral finasteride, I guess you can say. The patients on topical finasteride, though, had none of these systemic side effects, but they did complain of things like itching and redness of their scalp, which isn't too unusual when we're talking about topical treatments. But to put this all in perspective, remember that actually more people on topical finasteride dropped out of the study, and this could have been either because it wasn't working or maybe because it caused side effects. And also, if you look at table 3, the quality of life was much better in the patients taking oral finasteride than in those patients on topical finasteride, and that could have been because oral finasteride was just working better. So if these systemic side effects were so bad in the oral finasteride group, why was their quality of life so much better than in the patients on topical finasteride? I mean, something clearly doesn't make sense here. So this study shows possibly better outcomes with topical fen than oral fen with lower side effects, so it might be an alternative, but remember, the oral finasteride group did report an overall better quality of life. So go ahead and interpret that as you'd like, but it's clear the oral finasteride group was happier with their results compared to the topical finasteride group, maybe because it worked better and the incidence of side effects, although slightly higher, was still low or mild enough to be tolerable. However, I have to admit I am pretty disappointed in this study because the results are not clearly presented, and they failed to take advantage of the tricograms that they had to do hair counts, which could have given us a more objective result. So in the end, neither of these studies are overwhelmingly convincing, and the data is conflicting, since the first study showed that maybe topical finasteride was worse than oral, and the second showed the exact opposite. And again, it's also weird that the second study doesn't give any detailed info on hair counts or hair density, since they went through the trouble of getting a phototrichogram, but they didn't actually use it to its full extent. So the data is somewhat inconclusive. Now, my own take is that probably topical finasteride works in some people. I've used it before by mixing my own crushed Proscar tablets mixed with stamoxetine, but I didn't use this method for very long, as I eventually just found it much more convenient to just take the drug orally. Using it topically didn't give me any side effects, but then again, I don't get any side effects from using it orally either. So I think people should still just stick with oral finasteride, and if people do get side effects, they should probably try just lowering their dosage first under a doctor's supervision before switching to topical finasteride. But remember, side effects usually do go away on their own after a few months, so don't give up on oral finasteride prematurely. Go ahead and try to muscle through it, and there is a very good chance that the side effects will just go away on their own. However, in extreme circumstances where people have tried everything with oral finasteride and they just cannot use it even at doses as low as, say, 0.25 milligrams every other day, then maybe it may be worth taking a look at topical finasteride at 0.1%. Also, I have to say, if you are extremely frightened to take oral finasteride, you might want to try topical just because the notion of taking a topical rather than taking a drug orally may just be more reassuring to you. But if you do this, just realize the data on topical finasteride is not as solid as the data on oral finasteride. It's not clear if it works as well or if the side effect profile is really any different because the studies done so far are relatively small and their methodologies are somewhat flawed. Also, I know there are a lot of shady gray market websites that sell topical finasteride, and maybe they're legitimate or maybe they're not, and I don't know for sure, but if you want to make topical finasteride, keep in mind finasteride is soluble in alcohol. So if you want to make it yourself, you can. For instance, you can take 60 milliliters of topical minoxidil or stamoxetine, both of which contain alcohol, and mix 12 5 milligram Proscar tablets into the solution, and you will therefore wind up with 0.1% topical finasteride. You may have some, actually, you definitely will have some filler material in the solution, but it won't affect the concentration of the active ingredient significantly. So if you want to try it, I'd rather just go ahead and compound my own, or you can have a pharmacist compound it for you. And I'd rather do that than trust some shady gray market website where we can't verify the purity of the formulas. And for all we know, it may be brewed in some dirty bathtub in the basement of a Ukrainian brothel. So that's obviously not for me. Anyways, the bottom line is you're probably better off sticking with oral finasteride, although I'm not saying that topical finasteride at 0.1% is worthless. It's just that oral finasteride has a lot more data and it's probably better. So that's all I want to say about the subject. I'll see you guys next time.